Good afternoon. It's us again. Same team that delivered the non-budget event. Fortunately, on our part, we actually have a budget event this time. It seems that most of the issues have been leaked beforehand, so it's not that much of a surprise. Maybe to make the public used to that as well and accustomed to that. So most of the amendments are not new, and previously the budget review was also made available. So there's no real new issues that were indicated or added to the budget review and the more technical issues pertaining to the tax analysis. So to a large extent, we are more prepared than last time. So watch this space. It's the same team. It's Annabel Bishop, Chief Economist of Investec. It's Gerard Badenhorst, the head of our tax department, and then myself, Emil Brinker. So Annabel will start and indicate whether the markets perceive this on a more favorable basis than last time. And then Gerard will jump in, and then I will end up with the more technical issues pertaining to the budget review. So over to you, Annabel, and thank you so much. We really appreciate everybody making time to join us. It's always fun to share all of these issues with yourself, and thank you so much. Thanks, Annabel.
Yes, hi. I hope everyone can hear and see me.
Yes, all good.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll begin. So I think, as Emil said, it was an unsurprising budget. I think that's why it was received fairly neutrally by the financial markets. There was a little bit of movement, but around the same time, I think it's quite important to note, we actually saw the United States print a very important figure. And of course, that was their CPI inflation data. Why it's important is that the inflation figures inform, just as they do in South Africa, on whether or not they're in line for an interest rate cut this year. So coming out close to expectations, if not slightly better, that probably helped the rand a bit. Of course, our budget as well, coming out again close to expectations. And that really, here we're talking about the peaking in debt. So debt peaks at 76.2% next fiscal year, 25-26. And of course, that is very close to the 76.1% that we saw previously in February when the budget was planned but not presented, but the budget documents still leaked out. So I think the financial markets probably were quite relieved that there was not a deterioration in government borrowing. And the reason why this is key is that there obviously were worries that government might resort to that avenue, given that they were not able to get their 2% VAT hike through. Instead, what we saw is a 0.5% VAT increase scheduled for this year and another 0.5% VAT increase scheduled for next year. So this is quite key as government has dialed back from 2% in 1 year to 1% over 2 years. So what a 0.5% VAT increase does, or perhaps just take a step back, what a 2% increase in VAT would have done would have been to raise inflation by 1% over 12 months. So a 0.5% VAT increase tends to raise inflation by about 0.25% over 12 months, followed by another 0.25% over another 12 months. This is interesting because it might have been one of the reasons why our finance minister was not very keen to actually put through a reduction in the inflation target last year in the MTBPS, which would have meant that inflation no longer could average 4.5%, but might have had to average 4 or 3.5% to regain target. Currently, with inflation expected at 3.5% this year, should we have had that 2% VAT increase, that would have taken us to that 4.5% mark. So all in all, a fairly moderate budget. What do we mean by that? Well, for the financial markets, they really do look very closely at the debt to GDP ratio. And of course, as we said, debt to GDP expected to rise to around 76%. But after that, it comes down, the ratio falls. And indeed, the ratio falls out over the next 10 years, eventually to 67% of GDP, which is exactly the same trajectory that the MTBPS, or the budget update of October last year, had. So where we really are is that not very much has changed compared to October last year from a borrowing perspective. That's why financial markets really had a muted reaction. Of course, what would strengthen financial markets, particularly the bond market, would be if we actually saw borrowings drop quicker. And there are some thoughts we'll give later around that. But currently at the moment, we've really seen both the fiscal debt and deficits fairly come in line with the expectations. The interesting thing is on the economic growth side, National Treasury has a forecast of 1.9%, and that is expected for this year, GDP growth, and next year around about 1.8% for 2026 and 2027, similar to the Bloomberg consensus. The GDP figure that came out for 2024 most recently actually showed that GDP growth slowed to 0.6%, down from the 0.7% of 2023, which creates a lower base for GDP to start off with this year. Consequently, we've got a forecast of 1.3% for GDP this year, not 1.9%. Why that matters is part of the reason why the borrowing ratio jumped up this year. It was expected to peak at 75.5% next year, as opposed to 76.2%, is because GDP growth disappointed in 2024. That has implications both for revenue, but also, of course, as well for GDP as a percentage. So when you look at the fiscal ratios, the data is calculated as a percentage of GDP. Your debt is 76.2% as a percent of GDP, and of course your fiscal deficit, 5% of GDP. So all in all, while there was little surprise, the budget overall is reflective of weak economic growth from many different scores. And as we said earlier, the budget deficit for this year is now estimated close to 5%. It's a bit higher than was previously thought of. Eventually, it drops down to 3.5% by 27-28. But importantly, these are all projections. They're forecasts. They're estimates made by National Treasury. Instead, the trend has actually been typically to forecast these improving projections. But when it actually comes to it, when you actually get the figures printed each year, they always tend to miss and be a bit higher and result in fiscal slippage. I do think, however, the budget overall is fairly credit neutral, and we'd benchmark it against the medium-term budget policy statement, which occurred last year in October. In other words, there hasn't been enormous deterioration. There's only been modest fiscal slippage, as I said. The budget also shows a primary balance. This is where it starts to get a bit technical. Of course, the difference really here between expenditure and revenue, as we all know, is the fiscal deficit, the budget deficit, the mismatch, the gap, if you will, in government finances. Now, of course, if we take out expenditure on debt, then instead of having the budget balance, the budget deficit, we get the primary balance. So that's still expenditure and revenue, but of course, we take the expenditure on debt out of the expenditure line. That actually gives us a positive balance. What that really means is that government's revenue that it collects, mainly in taxes, and the money it spends are roughly in balance, if not a slight positive outcome, expenditure touch below revenue. However, it's really key that the reality of the situation is that we are still in a deficit because our expenditure on debt servicing costs are so high. It's actually at about 22% of GDP. Quite substantial. The tax to GDP ratio, 25%, also very substantial for a slow growth emerging market economy. Around the credit rating agencies, we've seen the Standard & Poor's, which is one of the three top or key credit rating agencies globally, besides Fitch and Moody's, actually put South Africa on a positive outlook last year, indicating the potential for an upgrade from our current BB- credit rating. Now, any BB credit rating is actually a non-investment grade credit rating, and this is quite key for us. We actually found ourselves in a situation where, having lost our investment grade credit rating, we're now sitting at sub-investment grade. But nevertheless, we're on a positive outlook, which means that S&P could upgrade us. The budget is not dissimilar to the one in October. Near-term fiscal slippage, but then longer-term same fiscal consolidation, and we now think that we won't get any credit rating downgrades or credit rating negative outlooks. Instead, we're probably likely to see S&P maintain its positive outlook. Let's be aware, however, though, the budget still needs to be passed by Parliament. It's been presented, but it's waiting to be passed. In its latest review of South Africa, S&P removed the large political risk component it previously had on the peaceful, stable nature of the elections, and of course the formation of the Government of National Unity. This was key to its upgrade to a positive outlook. So not an upgrade to the credit rating, but an upgrade to its outlook, meaning that it could upgrade the credit rating. The credit rating agency also noted, of course, as well, that since the formation of the Government of National Unity, there's been an improvement in financial markets and financing conditions, the currency strengthened, and the positive general outlook reflects their view of increased political stability following the May general elections. And of course, in turn, this could be an impetus for reform and could boost private investment and GDP growth. This might be a good point to make a comment on the fact the budget didn't go ahead last time, but did go ahead today. Essentially, really what is happening is a significant discussion amongst our, and I'm just having a look if there's any update on the news, but a significant discussion around the budget with our coalition partners against the VAT increase, as we know. So still concerns around the fact that we are finding ourselves in a situation where we have to have a tax increase. But of course, what's really important is that our tax collections need to improve, not through higher taxes, but instead through a situation where SARS actually manages to get the tax compliance up in the country. This could result in an additional 800 billion a year. Edward Kieswetter, our SARS commissioner, estimates, which of course could reduce the need for borrowing, could also aid with expenditure, and of course, eventually, even as it did in the 2000s, result in some tax decreases, which would stimulate economic growth. So a very positive development there. We did see that there was an increased allocation to SARS. It was given an extra 7.5 billion. And of course, that's quite key because that means that SARS will be on a stronger footing to improve South Africa's tax revenue organically. So I think that's one of the very positive outcomes as well from the budget. Besides, of course, from a financial market perspective, we didn't have a deterioration. So interesting that government has decided to switch a bit. What does it mean? Well, of course, the big VAT increases did draw in a lot of money. The VAT tax proposals themselves total 28 billion. The additional revenue raised mainly comes from no adjustment for the effect of inflation on tax and income tax. In other words, no adjustment for fiscal drag. No adjustment for individuals whose inflation salary increase pushes them into a higher tax bracket. There's no countervailing effect of having to pay similar taxes before. That's totaled 18 billion. Out of the 28 billion. Quite a significant increase. Then the second biggest item, as you would imagine, is the 13.5 billion from the 0.5% VAT increase. Medium term revenue is just under 28% of GDP, and of course the tax proposals increase the overall tax burden. So I think, where we find ourselves is that South Africa has come from a number of years of weak economic growth, insufficient tax revenue, and government is trying to balance the books. They're trying to prevent substantial expenditure overruns while simultaneously trying to avoid overburdening the economy with excessive debt compared to where we have been most recently. Our debt levels could be argued they are excessive. At 76% of GDP, it's well above the 60% mark of debt sustainability for an emerging market economy. But nevertheless, we didn't see a big acceleration. So these are the tax proposals, raising the tax take to fund increased expenditure, and of course, expenditure now as a percentage of GDP rising to about 32%. It does drop back near to 31% in the next few years, but it's still a big line item. Key now to return again to how the credit rating agencies see debt. They already include the state-owned entities' debt in their debt projections for South Africa. Standard & Poor's, Fitch, Moody's, all of them. They actually say we forecast gross government debt rising to 80% of GDP by fiscal 27 from 75 in fiscal 23. Now that includes Eskom, Transnet, and other entities' debt. That is quite important because we do find ourselves with significant debt guarantees from government on those state-owned entities' debt. And of course, the fact that it's already included there means that government bailouts, in other words, government actually assisting the state-owned entities, but in terms of their debt, not just giving them money, which goes on as an income line item, rather instead reducing their debt through taking it onto the government books, doesn't have much impact on the credit rating agency's view. So I think where we are at the moment is we know our government finances can still be described as weaker than they were 10 years ago. Perhaps to give an indication of where we really are, if we have a look at government debt as a percentage of GDP, which was closer to 25% in the 2000s, you can see at 76%, it has really ballooned enormously. As I said earlier, the average tax to GDP ratio is 25%, but the budget is highly redistributive, with the social wage, social grant payments, free basic education accounting for 61% of total expenditure if we take out interest payments. So there is a very, very redistributive budget here. Again, if we have a look at the tax tables, we'll see that there's about 500,000 people who earn 1.5 million in South Africa or above, paying for the bulk of taxation in South Africa. So you can see how highly redistributive the tax environment actually is. To give you an idea of the size of government debt, it's sitting at about 5.7 trillion rand, and the debt service costs are 22% of revenue. So you can see that there has been a big deterioration in government finances over the past few decades. As we said, it's a fairly unsurprising budget from a financial market perspective. We indicated the borrowings are largely contained. They do swell in the near term, but that's mainly on the disappointing GDP outcome last year of 0.6%. While there was a drought last year, if you take out the agricultural sector, the impact of the drought, you would have actually got 0.8% for GDP. Still very, very weak, and the drought is not the reason why we are in a weak growth economy. Excuse me. The recent weak economic growth outcome for 2024 is also disappointing for financial markets, while the rail and port crisis is seen to subtract around 4% from potential economic growth. And of course, the unemployment crisis persists as well. So really a better economic environment is needed to raise more revenue, in particular a substantially faster economic growth rate of 3 to 5%. And that would obviously bring in more tax. Tax increases on their own, VAT increases, income tax, other increases, tend to subtract from economic growth. So there's a dire need for much higher tax compliance in South Africa through bolstering SARS capacity. As we said, up to 800 billion could be raised a year, which would really eliminate the need for tax hikes going forwards and allow for lower borrowings and so credit rating upgrades and increased investment in growth. I wonder if anyone would like to ask a question at this point.
Yes, Annabelle, I'm dying to ask you this one. And it's really the Trump factor. How do you perceive the impact of the Trump factor on South African economy? Because there's so many things that happened in the last 2 weeks that you actually just you can't keep track.
Yes, so it does feel like your head's spinning. And of course, a huge amount going on, focused on South Africa, but really all over the world. We sort of look at it in two ways. One is that the foreign policy agenda is very important to the Trump administration. In the US, they obviously have used tariff threats to try and control illegal drugs coming into the country, particularly fentanyl, and of course as well illegal immigrants. So threatening harsh trade penalties, very harsh trade penalties on their neighboring countries if these don't reduce. Interestingly, on China as well, who's also seen as a fentanyl exporter illegally to the US. So he really has covered a huge number of areas, as you say, Emil. Really, we don't know where he gets the time, but obviously it's been storing this up for years. The important point here is that the tariffs that have come in, there was a fear at the start of the year that there would be a universal tariff. So essentially a large tariff increase on every single good that was imported into the US, blowing up US inflation and as a consequence, damaging the economy substantially. One of the reasons why the Republicans came to power and the Democrats lost was because of the very high cost of living that had been experienced under the Democrat regime. And of course, that was one of the calls to change that President Trump brought in. Interestingly, not only did we not get the universal tariff increase, but a inflation reduction of inflation cost containment, really a sort of not so much a policy, I suppose, but a drive has come in, and that really focuses on trying to keep inflation down in the US. The figure that came out today, as we said, a bit lower than expectations. So I think there's been market relief. To answer your question, market relief that we haven't seen the destructive policies that were feared from the Trump administration. Now, the other side of the coin, the huge expenditure cuts that are seen for the US, particularly in the federal government, civil service reduction, headcount, and a number of spending initiatives, many spending initiatives that the US administration is seeking to pull back from, including US aid to South Africa. All of those factors are also seen to reduce inflation in the United States, create a balance, if you will. So that's resulted in the US dollar weakening a bit. As we know, the US dollar is a safe haven currency. When there's concern in financial markets that there could be some form of turmoil, people often sell emerging market debt and equities, in fact, equities in general, which are seen as risky, and of course, instead pile into the safer US investments. So there has been some dollar weakness as things have not turned out as badly as people feared. There has been some rand strength on the back of that. Improvement in expectations for interest rate cuts this year. So things haven't been as bad as have been feared, but nevertheless, there has been a lot of activity. And looking forward, there's still unpredictably, still uncertainty. And of course, we wait to see what happens in terms of Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, and a number of other areas we haven't talked about in terms of actual physical wars and not trade wars we were discussing. Any other questions?
Annabelle, there is one on the chat from Philip. Any mention of national health insurance? Current budget deficit clearly indicates we can't afford this.
Yes, very, very much correct there, that it would really create huge damage to our budget to pull in, massive increase in expenditure. For the government, if we were to fund it. There's been little to no mention really on terms of the NHI. We did previously see a line item saying that they are giving a small allocation, I think it was under 10 billion, to the NHI to start some processes, some data collection, other areas, but certainly nothing to indicate any imminent or immediate start of the NHI in terms of impacting individuals in the economy from a healthcare perspective. Are there any other questions?
One more that's coming now from Kevin. Why has the ZAR remained stable despite the substantial weakness in the 10-year bond yields?
So I think, as we said earlier, the rand is against the US dollar has actually seen quite a substantial benefit from the weak inflation figures. People were worrying inflation would come out above inflation in the US, and instead has come out below inflation. In other words, what we're saying here is the Fed funds implied futures are showing a far greater chance, that's the financial markets expectations, of interest rate cuts in the US this year, 3 to 4 interest rate cuts, whereas previously there was only 1 cut expected. Now, cutting interest rates in the US obviously reduces financial return on instruments that are influenced by interest rates, and that, of course, in turn weakens the US dollar, and the rand tends to strengthen against it. So a bit of disappointment on the South African government bond front, because there is that small increase, as we talked about, in borrowing. Previously, government debt was expected to peak at 75.5% of GDP, now it's 76.2%. I think also as well, however, that the budget, even though it says it is not as pro-growth as it could be. I suppose also as well, there's a bit of negative sentiment. We need to wait and see how the increased allocation to SARS pans out in terms of does it provide substantial increased revenue? Is it enough, the money allocation, to turn things around and to increase tax compliance? Particularly key for the bond market is, does it mean it can actually eventually see peaking in government debt? Because every year we're told that government debt's going to peak next year, and we never get to that year. It continues to be every year. So of course that does create some negative sentiment for bonds as well. But of course, for South Africa, let's not forget bonds are also heavily influenced by inflation, and the 2 VAT increases this year and next year will have upward pressure on South Africa's inflation and could curtail the possibility of interest rate cuts in South Africa, which in turn also has a negative impact on bond yields. Okay, I think we're at the end of my period that I'm allocated for. So unless there's a further question, I'll probably have to say goodbye now. And of course, we can always talk to clients who wish to. If anyone wishes to contact me by email, that of course will be great, and we can continue the conversation there. Also, of course, as well, if anyone would like to receive my economic research, you're very welcome to as well. I'm sure Emile will send me contact details of people who wish to receive it.
Thanks so much, Annabelle.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again also from my side, Annabelle, for those insights and also for the analysis on the economic implications of the budget and for sharing that with us, and thank you for your time as well. So yeah, just from a value-added tax perspective, before we get into the details of the VAT rate increase and its implications, just the revenue that is expected to be collected for this financial year, 31 March 2025, is 460 billion rand, which is just under 25% of the total tax collections. As expected, it remains around about 25% of total tax collections. We'll have to wait and see next year, if that percentage of total tax collections will increase as a result of the proposed VAT rate increase. Just one observation here is that the Minister and the Commissioners indicated that the VAT collections from the domestic supplies are on par or slightly better than what they've expected, but there was a contraction in the VAT collected from imports. Now, I just have some difficulty with regard to the VAT on the imports. Why that is important? Because most of the imports, if not a substantial percentage of that, is actually imported, or the goods are imported by registered vendors who acquires those goods for making taxable supplies and will be entitled to claim an input tax deduction. But be that as it may, the VAT collections seems to be on par. They are a little bit less than what is expected, but it remains around about 25% of total collections. If we look further on the next slide, please, the VAT rate increase, as we've become to know now, is that because of the proposed 2% rate increase or 2 percentage point rate increase at the first round of the budget, that is why the budget was postponed. Now, the Minister has opted now for a phased increase, as Annabelle has indicated, 0.5 percentage point this year, effective the 1st of May 2025. And then a further 0.5 percentage point to bring it up to 16% with effect from the 1st of April 2026. With regard to the VAT rate increase, the Minister attempted to motivate it by referring to other countries or peer countries that he's referred to, about 43 countries in total. He's compared the South African VAT rate to various other countries and has indicated that the average VAT rate for these countries is 19%. And he's concluded that the South African current VAT rate of 15% compares very well and is very low compared to the average of 19%. But I think one shouldn't consider the VAT rate in isolation. If we just take as an example our neighbor Botswana, Botswana's got a VAT rate of 14%, but the primary healthcare is virtually exempt for VAT purposes, and their primary education is exempt for VAT purposes. They've got a corporate tax rate of 22% and a maximum personal income tax rate of 25%. Their VAT rate is 14%. Very similar situation in the Scandinavian countries, for example, where their VAT rates are 25%. But virtually everything in that country or those countries are exempt, and one doesn't have to pay for any of those services. In addition to that, their corporate rates and their personal income tax rates are very low compared to ours. And those countries have taken a policy decision that they move away from direct taxes to consumption taxes. So that is why their VAT rates are so high. So I think it's dangerous just to look at the VAT rate in isolation and compare ours to other countries to say that, and to draw the conclusion that our VAT rate is fairly low compared to other countries. Then if we move on to the implications of the VAT rate increase, Annabelle has also mentioned that we've got an expected additional revenue of between 13.5 billion to 15 billion for each 0.5 percentage point increase. But that increase does have an impact on our poor households. Now, again, the Minister has put in his budget review a table which indicates that about or more than 75% of the total VAT collections are collected from high-income households, the top 3 deciles of households. Now, that may be true, but one also need to consider that these households are the persons who can afford to pay the tax. What is important, I think, is that one need to consider that poor and low-income households spend a substantial larger proportion of the disposable income on VAT. And that is where the impact then comes in as far as the VAT rate increases on these households, where it does have a major impact and also a regressive impact of the VAT on the system. We do have the proposal that the VAT rate will increase with effect from the 1st of May this year, which is only in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. But what one needs to consider as well is whether the VAT rate will be passed by Parliament. I think this time around, it seems that there has been quite a lot of consultation and discussions and internal consultations as far as the budget is concerned. And I think it would be prudent to assume that these increases will be passed by Parliament. And that would mean that businesses now already would need to get their systems in place, review their accounting systems, their point of sale systems, their billing systems, and also the reports that they get out of their system in order to complete their VAT returns. Now, as we know, the VAT returns don't cater for 2 rates, and so certain suppliers, particularly over the transitional period, will be at 15%, some will be at 15.5%. The same with the purchases on the input tax side. So one would need to be able to obtain that information from the systems. And we expect that because the VAT return will not be revised, that we will have to work around the reporting side as we had to do at the previous rate increase on the 1st of April in 2018. Where entities or persons have entered into contracts or agreements that provides for the 15% VAT payable, or provides for consideration payable inclusive of 15% VAT. Section 67 of the VAT legislation will provide protection in the sense that they are entitled to increase the VAT collections in accordance with the additional VAT rate. One also would need to consider the time of supply provisions, which are contained in Section 9 and Section 67 capital A of the VAT legislation, to determine When is a supply subject to VAT at the old rate? When will it be subject to VAT at the new rate? And then Section 67A, importantly, also contains certain anti-avoidance provisions that one needs to take cognizance of. We will, over the next week or so, provide in our newsletters detailed information as to the application of these time of supply rules and how one determines when one needs to apply the current rate or the new rate. A further consideration is that, unfortunately, there are certain industries that are more impacted than others because of the type of transactions that they enter into, specifically the non-life insurance industry and the financial services industry. Because the transactions of these entities and industries are not dealt with specifically in Section 67 capital A of the VAT legislation. And we had various practical difficulties with the last VAT rate increase, where we were in discussions with National Treasury and also with SARS to introduce legislation amendments to cater for these particular difficulties. Unfortunately, they haven't done so, so we're going to have to go through this whole process again with this current VAT rate increase. If we consider the specific VAT proposals in the budget, firstly, as we have expected with the VAT rate increase, there must also be certain relief measures, particularly for poor and low-income households. So the proposal in this regard to bring relief for these households is to expand the list, the current list of zero-rated food items, to include edible offal of sheep, poultry, goats, pigs and cattle, and then also specific cuts such as head, the feet, bones and tongues. Certain dairy liquid blends, we don't have the details of that yet, so we'll see that when the legislation comes through as to what products will be zero rated or included in the zero rating, and then canned and bottled vegetables as well. So the challenge here is whether as to whether the producers and the retailers will actually pass on the zero rating or the benefits of the zero rating to the consumers, or whether they will simply retain it as an additional profit on their side. So only time will tell in this regard. The foregone revenue for the fiscus in zero rating these additional items, the minister has indicated that it would amount to approximately 2 billion rand per annum. With regard to the further VAT proposals in the budget, some of them, well, actually most of them are fairly technical, so I will provide some context as to what gave rise to the proposals and then the implications thereof. Firstly, on the importation of low-value goods, we do have an exemption currently that if you import goods of less than 100 Rand per parcel, then there's an exemption for import VAT. Now, this has been taken advantage of for foreign online suppliers of these goods that are not registered for VAT in South Africa. So the proposal is that these importation of the low-value goods will be revisited to bring them on par with the with the local suppliers who have to charge VAT even though they are the low-value goods or less than 100 Rand. Where you have a business that have been disposed of as a going concern, we do have a provision in the legislation that allows the purchaser or the new owner of the business, where goods are returned by customers to the new owner, which had been originally purchased from the seller of the going concern, that the new owner is entitled to issue credit notes and to claim an input tax deduction in respect of those goods that are returned. Now, these provisions do not extend to the transfers of going concerns under the rollover relief provisions under Section 42 and Section 45 of the Income Tax Act, which are specifically dealt with under Section 8, subsection 25 of the VAT legislation, which deems the transferor and the transferee to be one and the same person. So the proposal is that the same benefit or concession will also apply to these transfers of going concerns under Section 42 and 45, that the goods are returned to the transferee, that the transferee is entitled to issue credit notes and claim an input tax deduction. Intermediaries currently that supply electronic services on behalf of foreign electronic service providers are deemed to be the supplier of those electronic service services. So they are entitled to register for VAT purposes and also to account for VAT on behalf of the foreign electronic services providers. The proposal here is that those provisions will be expanded to include also local suppliers of electronic services, to entitle or enable an intermediary to act on behalf of local suppliers of electronic services on the same basis. Where one has the provision of gold containing material, particularly by gold mines, to a refinery, the refinery generally commingles that material with all suppliers, of the material, and then refines the gold from the material that is provided by various depositors or suppliers of the material, with the result that as a result of the commingling, the refined gold can no longer be identified to have been originally supplied by a particular producer of gold. So the refinery generally exports the gold or supplies it locally to a bank or to the South African Reserve Bank or the Mint Company, which is zero rated for VAT purposes. But the practical difficulty is that the original supplier of the gold, the mine, does not hold the required documentation to prove that the gold that it provided was the gold that was exported. So we had rulings that was submitted or provided by SARS to the gold industry in this regard that found its way into legislation with effect from the 1st of April last year under Section 54, subsection 2, capital C. Now, this provision allows the refinery to act as an agent or acting as agent on behalf of the gold mines in order to obtain the documentation on behalf of the gold mines, and that documentation will then serve as supporting documents to substantiate the application of the zero rate. But the gold containing material that the mines provide for refining also contains a small amount of silver. And exactly the same issues and practical difficulties apply with regard to the supply of silver. So the proposal here is that Section 54(2)(c) will be expanded to also cover the exportation of silver by the refinery on behalf of the gold mines. Then we want, just the previous slide, please. The last bullet point there. Where one exports goods on the basis that you deliver the goods to a recipient in South Africa, a foreign recipient who will then export the goods from South Africa, an indirect export, then one can apply the rate of 0% in certain circumstances, which are regulated by the so-called indirect export regulations. And one of these circumstances are contained in Regulation A2E, which stipulates that where you deliver goods at an harbour or at an airport, and those goods are delivered to the port authority or to the airline pilot, or if you bring it within the precinct of the airport, and those goods are destined for export, that one can apply the rate of 0%. Now, a difficulty has arisen here, for example, where you supply the goods to an individual or a private company that is operating within a particular harbour. An example here is if a coal mining company delivers gold, let's say to the Richards Bay Coal Terminal, which is a private company and operates within the Richards Bay Harbour, and those goods, that coal, the ownership thereof then passes to a non-resident at Richards Bay Coal Harbour destined for export from South Africa. That SARS has taken a view that those exports do not qualify for the zero rate because Richards Bay Coal Terminal is not a port authority, but a private company. And clearly, although the private entity may operate within a precinct under the auspice and governance of the Port Authority, technically SARS is saying that those exports do not qualify for the zero rate. Now, in order to address this anomaly, the proposal is that the regulation will be amended to cater for these types of supplies where the supplies are made within the precinct of the harbour for export from South Africa, that the zero rate will also apply. Then the further VAT proposals, a welcome proposal is with regard to clinical trials. Now, where clinical trials are conducted for a foreign customer or foreign entity, the question has arisen as to whether those clinical trials qualify for the zero rate. Now, again, SARS has taken a view in this regard on the basis that the clinical trials, where they involve patients in South Africa or movable goods in South Africa, like blood samples or water samples, which are tested in South Africa and the test results are provided to the foreign customer, that those services do not qualify for the zero rate because the services are either rendered to persons in South Africa or relates to movable goods in South Africa which are not exported. Now, clearly, the important and the valuable result is the trial results that are provided to the foreign customer. And it's those results that are consumed by the foreign customer outside of South Africa. And any benefit that is derived in South Africa by a patient is totally incidental. And in any event, blood samples and water samples will just don't have any value and will just be disposed of after the trials are completed. So the proposal here is that clinical trials will be reviewed, and it will be considered and proposed that these trials will qualify for the rate of 0%. As far as the domestic reverse charge regulations are concerned, these regulations were revised last year with the amendment to the definition of residue, where this definition was limited to residue arising from or incidental to mining operations. Now, this caused a practical difficulty in the sense that where you do now have scrap gold that is provided and supplied together with other items that clearly fall within the definition or within the ambit of the regulations, like jewelry, for example, or even broken jewelry, then it becomes extremely difficult to identify now what falls within and what falls without or outside of the regulations. So the proposal here is to address this difficulty, that the limitation to mining operations be excluded from the definition of residue, that it be made as wide as possible so that all types of gold scrap items then will be considered to be residue, which will fall within the domestic reverse charge regulations. Following the judgment of the Constitutional Court in the case of Capitec Bank, which dealt with loan cover that was provided to customers free of charge in the case when they get retrenched or when they pass away, where the court decided or determined that these provision of these loan cover services is partially for making taxable supplies and partially in relation to their loan book, and therefore a certain portion of the VAT in respect of payments made under that insurance can qualify for an input tax deduction. National Treasury has now indicated that the definition of insurance will be revisited in view of that judgment, and we expect that the manner in which that will be revised is that insurance will exclude any insurance or guarantee that is provided for no consideration. When on the 1st of April 2022, Section 18D was introduced into the VAT legislation to specifically deal with the VAT implications where a developer develops residential property for sale, but temporarily lets that property in the interim. Now that Section 18D was, with respect, badly written. It was open for interpretation. It has been amended a number of times. And the proposal is now that this Section 18D, together with all the consequential amendments that were made as a result thereof, will be revisited, and hopefully all the remaining interpretational problems and issues will be eliminated. Certain foreign telecommunication companies sell their vouchers in South Africa for use outside of South Africa. Now, this is typically a foreign telco company that sells airtime vouchers to South African to individuals that have got family members in other countries. So they would then typically provide the PIN numbers of the airtime vouchers that they obtained to their family members outside of South Africa, who uses then the vouchers exclusively outside of South Africa. Now, these airtime vouchers are sold in South Africa through distributors, and those distributors currently charge VAT on the sale thereof. But in view thereof that the consumption of these vouchers are totally, and the services are totally outside of South Africa, you can't use these vouchers in South Africa. The proposal is that the sale of these vouchers should be zero rated. Then lastly, under the Tax Administration Act, two proposals that deal with VAT issues. The first one is with regard to VAT disputes on importation of goods. We currently do have the situation that where you import goods into South Africa, although the VAT is payable under the VAT Act, it's administered under the or by SARS Customs. Now, if there's a dispute with regard to the value or the penalties and interests that are being imposed, then the question is, how do you take this dispute forward? Is it under the customs legislation, or is it under the VAT or Tax Administration Act? And in many, or in some instances at least, an internal appeal was submitted under the customs legislation as well as a VAT objection with regard to the VAT that was raised. And all these disputes relate to exactly the same thing. So the proposal is that the Tax Administration Act will be amended to clarify the dispute resolution rules that need to be followed in these circumstances, where both customs and the VAT and on the VAT stroke Tax Administration Act on the one side applies. So that is really good news because we do have difficulties as far as these disputes are concerned. The budget review refers to importation of goods, but we hope it will be expanded to the exportation of goods as well, because the same issues apply there. Then as far as the voluntary VAT registrations are concerned, currently the Tax Administration Act provides for inspection of premises of taxpayers in certain circumstances. The proposal is that these provisions entitling SARS to carry out these inspections will be expanded to voluntary VAT registrations, where SARS believes that it is appropriate to visit it's appropriate to visit the premises to determine as to whether these premises are actually used and capable of being used for the enterprise that is applied for voluntary registration. Right, and then just lastly, just to close off, these are all the proposals then that is contained in the budget review. Just to close off then, from my side on the VAT side, is that we still have draft regulations that were issued on the 1st of August last year, which is still in draft form, which have not been finalized yet. And the first one here is electronic services with a proposed implementation date of the 1st of April 2025, essentially proposing that foreign suppliers of electronic services would not need to would not need to account for VAT on supplies of electronic services to vendors in South Africa. So if they only supply electronic services to vendors in South Africa, then they don't need to register for VAT and account for VAT. The second one is the domestic reverse charge regulations, which proposed essentially that primary gold producers like mines would also be included in the domestic reverse charge regulations and need to account for VAT accordingly, also with an implementation date of the 1st of April 2025. And then the third one relates to casinos and the determination of VAT payable in respect of table games of chance. And there the implementation date was proposed to be the 1st of January this year. Now, we haven't seen any of these regulations as yet. We're already in the middle of March, so I think it's very unlikely that we will see the final regulations before the end of the month. But if we do so, I think it's very unlikely that the implementation date will be a retrospective implementation date. We have requested National Treasury to advise as to what is the status of these regulations. We have not received a response yet. They're probably still busy with the budget. But as soon as we get that, then we will convey that information via our newsletters. Thank you. That brings me to the end of the VAT session. Are there any questions in this regard that we need to deal with at this point? Then over to you, Emil.
Thank you, Gerard. At least you have security of tenure for the next few years. So, as I said, don't hang on your boots yet. In relation to the income tax consequences, I adopted a different approach compared to the one that we adopted in February, in the sense that I don't repeat any of the issues which I've mentioned. One. Two, I also pitch it at a bit of a higher level. So please excuse me if I become a bit technical, but I think also maybe to address some of the higher specialized type of issues and industries and all those type of things that I think one should be aware of. I think the key issue from today is really that 22 cents of every rand that you pay as tax at this stage will amount and go towards debt servicing. So it's a massive amount if you really look at that. And as Annabelle's also said, even though it will stabilize and go down a bit, to pay this type of amount and percentage for every rand that's raised in revenue is really substantial. And I don't think it's really economical from that perspective. And that really brings me to the second general point. It seems that the apparent rift between the Minister of Finance and the Commissioner for the South African Revenue Service has been healed. Ironically, just after the previous budget speech that didn't take place, the Commissioner cancelled a number of events. But thereafter, during the G20 meeting, he actually repeated his stance and views that one should bolster the ability of SARS to collect taxes. And we then also saw it today with the increased amounts that have been allocated, the 3.5 million and the 4 billion that have been allocated towards SARS. So I think we may well see a different approach in the context of SARS to strengthening the bolstering of the collection ability. So one should maybe prepare oneself for all of those type of issues going forward. Probably also aimed at non-taxpayers, medium enterprises, all those type of things, as opposed to just higher net worths, even though there's also the same type of issue there. So one should probably see how the increased amounts are going to be allocated in relation to the enforced collection ability of SARS. But one thing is sure, that one should expect a more stringent approach on the part of SARS. Bracket creep, unfortunately, the same issue. So it's actually beneficial for us if the inflation rate is lower, because then at least we can spend our monies, but otherwise the brackets remain the same. So even though we earn more, we're going to pay more taxes, but effectively and economically it's not the same. Then excise duties, interesting. It seems that there's a bit of a showdown coming between, on the one hand, National Treasury and the alcohol industry, and then on the other hand, between beer and wine spirits, because basically the increase is the same, 6.75%, but at least it's only effective 1 April as opposed to the day upon which it is announced. Because previously it was thought that there would be anti-avoidance and avoidance steps that will be taken if and to the extent that the increase in the excise duties would become effective at a later stage. So at this stage, at least, the industry has more time to prepare for that. But one also has the issue of beer being a lesser alcohol content, the wine industry potentially having more labor contributing to the economy, but on the other hand, a higher alcohol content. So it's all those type of things that will have to be taken into account ultimately in the structure that will be adopted. There was a discussion paper that was released last year, and I think at this stage then one will have to watch the space, but a solution will have to be found in relation to the imposition of the excise duties. Then one small issue, I'm actually not sure whether there's any smartphones that cost less than 2,500 Rand, but if it is, you're not going to pay excise duties. I think if you look at some of the iPhones nowadays, it's 30,000 Rand, 40,000 Rand. That's the type of number that you're looking at. So yes, to the extent that you pay less than 2,500 Rand, you're not going to pay excise duties. As Gerhard has indicated, I'm not sure whether this benefit will be passed on to consumers, but let's see. Then if you look at some of the more technical issues, suspect trades, that's really Section 20 capital A, where you receive income or engage in certain industries like rental accommodation, farming, gambling, creative arts, crypto assets, all those type of things. Because it's likely that you could make a substantial loss as well in those type of industries if you focus on that, especially farmers, because we all know about the professionals earning income and spending then all the money on the farming losses. Gambling, yes, you just don't know unless you're very lucky. So all those type of things are what we call suspect trades. And at this stage, Section 20 Cap A then ring fences those losses that you cannot set off against other income. But at this stage, the safe haven rules do not apply if you've incurred assessed losses for at least 6 years for the 10-year period ending on the last day of the year of assessment. But it only applies to the extent that you actually have taxes and pay taxes at the marginal rate. And that threshold and the rates will be reduced such that you can't now argue that I actually pay tax at the lesser rate and then on that basis make use of these type of losses. So I expect that the rate will be reduced substantially in order to avoid a scenario where one can set off the losses associated with these type of industries, farming, renting of residential accommodation, those type of things, against your other income, because it's perceived to be potential abuse. Just on that one, interestingly enough, there's a number of provisions that actually attempt to close loopholes in the budget review. One of them really also deals with preference shares. Now, preference shares have become very popular in order to provide funding to debtors as opposed to loans that are made. Technically speaking, however, if you're the holder of a preference share, you're just a shareholder and you're not a creditor. And if you're a creditor, you're only a concurrent creditor. Whereas if you're a lender of a loan and a lender of record, then you can obtain security and obtain a secured right in that context. However, if you look at the way in which preference share transactions are structured nowadays, the holders of preference shares more often than not actually have a better right than the holders of debt. And in some instances, for instance, the holders of debt subordinate their claims against the debtor in favor of the preference shareholders. So effectively, preference shares are elevated to being a debt and a secured debt as opposed to being a shareholder and coming last. So there are two sections in the Income Tax Act that deal with the conversion and the recharacterization of the exempt dividends that you receive, because obviously financial institutions would like to receive exempt dividends as opposed to taxable income in the form of interest. The first one is really Section 8E, which deals with hybrid equity instruments that essentially, to the extent that you're obliged to redeem a preference share within 3 years, then the dividends are converted into taxable income. But it also exists to the extent that you have a preference share that's secured by a financial instrument or subject to an arrangement in terms of which a financial instrument may not be disposed of unless it's issued for a qualifying purpose, i.e., basically to acquire shares in an operating company. So the issue ultimately is, when do you actually have a preference share where it's secured, not secured by a financial instrument or subject to an arrangement where a financial instrument may not be disposed of? One good example is, for instance, that you must put money into an interest-free bank account, because that's not security. You just put money in an interest-free bank account. Is that really security? Or does that convert your arrangement then into a hybrid equity instrument? Or alternatively, to the extent that you have a cash flow waterfall and you actually rank first in relation to the dividends that are declared as opposed to other debtors and other other debt that's owing, do you actually have security in this context? Because that's really the type of scenario that could convert then the exempt dividends into taxable income. And that's really the type of focus area that will be dealt with by the legislation. We'll have to see to what extent it's going to be introduced, but that's definitely one of the issues that one will have to be careful of. The next one is Section 8E, that also converts exempt dividends into taxable income should you actually have an enforcement right, basically a right to require any third party to pay the dividends or to redeem the preference shares. Once again, the exempt dividends are then recharacterized into taxable income, and we call it's a third-party backed share. Now, the first issue is really that if the issuer provides that security, you never fall within this provision. So even though from a company law perspective, it is debatable whether an issuer can ever give security for the redemption of preference shares, that does take place. The other one is also, for instance, to what extent may you have indirect guarantees or facilitations or cash flows? Because once again, if you have a cash flow waterfall and you rank at the bottom of the cash flow waterfall at the top, do you actually facilitate the repayment of the preference shares, the redemption thereof, or for instance, the payment of the dividends? So once again, the context of an enforcement right will be extended so as to cater for these type of things and to close this perceived loophole. So one will have to see how that is going to pan out. But I expect there to be some consternation in that industry, similar to what we saw with reference to the changes in the enforcement right and the ability to invest in what we call an operating company, and the scenario where the operating company no longer was an operating company subsequently. And I think one is probably going to have the same type of debates that one had otherwise. Then asset for share transactions. This, and I can maybe use it as the type of Steinhoff, and we all know Steinhoff and what happened there. But essentially, to the extent that one transfers shares, let's say I transfer shares to Gerhard, we both companies, there's rollover relief to the extent that I acquire a 10% shareholding in Gerhard, or be the transferee, the purchaser. So let's assume that one is dealing with Steinhoff, and Steinhoff purchases shares from a seller. The seller could obtain rollover relief to the extent that it acquired a 10% shareholding in Steinhoff, or to the extent that the Steinhoff shares were listed only one share. And then there's no immediate taxes because you acquire the shares in Steinhoff at the regional base cost, and Steinhoff acquires the shares in the target company also at the regional base cost. Now, there's one exception in the context of listed shares, and that is, for instance, if Steinhoff would have acquired shares in another listed company, call it Mattress World or whatever the case may be, one of its investments. Mattress World obviously was a foreign investment, but let's assume it was a local investment. So to the extent that Steinhoff then acquired at least 35% of the equity shares in Mattress World, or 25% if nobody else held the equal greater number of the equity shares, there were a number of benefits for Steinhoff. So the seller of the shares didn't obtain the benefit so much because it still acquired the shares in Steinhoff at the regional base cost. But one of the key issues for Steinhoff really was that it acquired the shares in Mattress World at market value. So if ever it sold it, the capital gains tax liability would have been much less. And also the CTC, the share capital that's created pursuant to the issue of the shares, would be equal to market value. So there's substantial benefits in making use of that exemption. Now, to some extent, it may have been abused in the past, and SARS has now indicated, the National Treasury has indicated that this exemption will only apply to the extent that one holds less than 20% of the equity shares in the target company. That's the Mattress World. If you sell that, as opposed to obtaining the rollover relief and the step up in the base cost of the relevant shares, because that's really the benefit that you have if you make use of this exemption, and to the extent that you acquire shares in a listed company. Obviously, one of the issues was always that the listed company that you acquired was going to be delisted. So you had to retain that listed company status for at least a day before you delist, because otherwise the exemption wouldn't apply. So those are the type of transactions I think that are now focused upon, such that you do not get a double tier of benefits, i.e. rollover relief and a step up in your base cost, being the purchaser that acquires then the base cost step up, or the base cost step up in relation to the shares in the listed company that it acquires. Covered persons, also one of the key issues. It's become very popular of late, equity-linked notes that people invest in, because essentially it's there for 5 years, and you don't receive dividends or anything like that. And after 5 years, you cash in the equity-linked note, the ELN, and you receive a capital gain in respect thereof, because the argument is you do not know whether or not you actually sell it at the profit or loss at that stage, because the ELN really pays an amount to you with reference to a specified index, like the MSCI or the LC 40 or whatever the case may be, a basket of equities. So if you invest in the ELNs, there's a real likelihood that you could actually obtain a capital gain pursuant to the realization thereof, say after a period of 5 years. Now, it does seem that the way in which the banks hedge themselves in order to pay the amount under the ELN would have been to actually just invest into a deposit or a bond, and then also have a call option in respect of that basket of shares. And to the extent that they receive dividends, it would have been exempt, or they deduct amounts in circumstances where the amounts received by the holders of the ELNs would not be taxable. So it seems that this anomaly has been identified by National Treasury and SARS, and that they're actually going to introduce legislation so as to provide for parity. Parity probably that you can't make use of the deduction or that the dividends are taxable, but we'll have to see to what extent provisions are going to be inserted in that context or introduced. However, as I said, ELNs have become very popular. More and more taxpayers invest in that because you obtain an exposure to the equity market. And for instance, you have a guarantee such that to the extent that the index of that equity or the basket of equities drop, that you always receive back your capital that you invest or a percentage of that. So it's quite beneficial to investors. You have the security, especially in the volatile equity market, that you at least receive back the amount that you've invested. And on the other hand, it appears that banks either didn't pay tax or claimed deductions in respect of the hedging activities, which resulted in that type of mismatch. So that's one of the issues that then will be addressed. Some international taxes, couple of, once again, attempted loopholes that will be charged. One transaction, it's quite interesting, and I'm not sure how it was picked up, to the extent that the foreign subsidiary does a reverse takeover in respect of the holding company. It was quite interesting that it's picked up because in itself there wouldn't be an exit charge if it's a reverse takeover where the subsidiary actually acquires shares in the holding company and so does a reverse takeover. So that type of issue will be addressed. Also the safe haven rule in relation to the 67% of tax. So to the extent that you have a subsidiary or you invest in the Netherlands or the UK and all those type of things, and that subsidiary pays at least 67.5% of the tax that you would have paid in South Africa, then you do not need to do the calculation for CFC purposes. But however, National Treasury has now picked up that in some instances there's a refund to shareholders as opposed to the company itself, and that should be taken into account to determine whether or not there's at least a 67.5% tax that's paid. Also foreign pensions, in terms of certain tax treaties, neither the foreign country nor South Africa can tax the pensions. To the extent that there's a foreign pension, that will also now be closed, such that South Africa can in fact then levy the taxes in relation to that. Lastly, the most important issue probably for me relates to USP understatement penalties and Section 222 and Section 223. Because those of you that have received assessments or additional assessments, always, as a matter of course, also see at the end thereof the imposition of USP, whether it's 10% being a substantial understatement or of late, generally no reasonable care taken in the completion of a tax return, 25% or 50%. And to the extent that USP is levied, there's also interest on the USP. So that makes an assessment very expensive as opposed to a taxpayer just paying the tax associated with the misdemeanor. For instance, if you deducted entertainment expenses and you shouldn't have claimed the deduction in respect of that. USP and the imposition of USP has made this very costly, and as a matter of course, SARS imposes USP. And we saw pursuant to the Coronation and the Thistle Trust cases that there's two ways in which you can actually avoid the imposition of the USP. The one is where there's a tax petitioner providing an opinion in respect of the matter that it's more likely than not that the court will support the view adopted by the taxpayer. And to the extent that this opinion is actually obtained before the submission of the return. That's the one leg. But people shouldn't confuse that with the real issue of Thistle Trust and Coronation, that is whether or not there's a bona fide inadvertent error. Because those cases indicated that you can obtain opinion after the fact. You can consult with your auditors when you submit your income tax return. You can be bona fide because there's no intention on your part to actually avoid the taxes. Now, all of those factors will result in you having committed a bona fide inadvertent error, and in terms of these cases, SARS cannot impose USP, they must waive it. Because of the fact that you took all steps, all reasonable steps of a taxpayer in order to ensure that you adopted the correct approach in relation to the submission of your return or the deduction of expenses. to happen now is that this approach, the bona fide inadvertent error, will only apply to the first column. And that is really where you have a substantial understatement and not where there's any unreasonability, gross negligence, tax avoidance, all those type of things. So your only argument that you have and where you can not pay, where you would not pay USP, is where you just have a substantial understatement, simple case where 10% USP would have been imposed. The moment any other USP percentage is applicable, from column 2 to 6, reasonable care, completing the return, gross negligence, tax avoidance, GAR, all those type of things, in those cases, you wouldn't be able to argue that there's a bona fide inadvertent error. So that ability is cut off and only to apply in the context of substantial understatement. I don't think it's necessarily fair because if you take all of these steps, it should be reasonable, even though then SARS may argue it's not reasonable. And there's always going to be this debate whether or not you fall into the first category or any of the other categories. Because SARS will argue that you fall into the other categories and therefore the USP applies, and you will argue as a taxpayer that you fall into the first column, a substantial understatement, and therefore it's a bona fide inadvertent error. So it's going to be quite a hotly debated topic here, especially given the fact that the Constitutional Court endorsed the approach adopted by the taxpayers in the Supreme Court of Appeal in Thistle Trust and Coronation. And that is the current position, that there be a bona fide inadvertent error, irrespective whether your conduct falls into column 1 or column 3 or column 5. So in those cases, if you've taken those steps, whether or not you actually provide the legal opinion to SARS, there will be the bona fide inadvertent error, no USP will be imposed. So I think it's going to be a massive issue in relation to this because of the impact of USP upon an assessment. It's all good and well if you pay the capital amount, the amounts are disallowed together with the interest. By the way, the interest is also not deductible. But the moment USP is levied to that assessment and there's interest on the USP, then it becomes quite an expensive exercise in relation to the default that was committed, even though it was inadvertent in the circumstances. So I think there should still be an ability to argue that even in the other cases, USP should not be imposed, as opposed to now only being reliant upon the first alternative, that is an opinion from a tax petitioner to the effect that your position is more likely than not to be upheld to the extent that the matter goes to court. So this probably is one of the most significant amendments that has been made of late. And I think it's going to be hardly apart now from all the other issues, apart from the fact that the Constitutional Court adopted a certain approach, that this is now sought to be amended because of the imposition of USP and the impact thereof upon the total amount that the taxpayer has to pay if an additional assessment is issued. So it's quite a significant issue. Any questions? Sorry, I saw a question somewhere, but I missed that. No, it doesn't seem to be the case. So thank you so much to everybody, all the speakers, and those of you that attend, most importantly, because we've run over time, about half an hour or so, but we really appreciate you joining us and supporting us. Also, Karishka and the marketing team for all their arrangements. We really appreciate that. We're also going to distribute a newsletter this afternoon or this evening in relation to the amendments. Please have a look at that because it deals with all of the amendments that we've mentioned also during this budget speech and the review. Thank you so much to everybody.